the appropriate response to the LGBTQ plus community, or how do we respond without compromising the gospel of Jesus?
You want to add this one to it?
Yes, and so we've got two that are closely related here. How do we approach our positions on transgender / gender dysphoria without offending them by not using their chosen pronouns? And basically, how do we relate to our friends who are in these various states of really questioning? But again, so let's start with this first one, and then we'll work our way into that second one, because there's some additional complications there. The question of identity is not simple anymore, is it? It used to be a pretty straightforward question to say, who am I? But now that has tremendous political implications as well. It has sociological implications. It's got all of these different implications. And part of that has to do with what we've been talking about, again, the fact if identity is in your hands alone, and it's up to you to define who you are, it looks a little bit like our world right now. Chosen pronouns, this whole phenomenon doesn't really, I think from a Christian standpoint, it's not very surprising, especially given the radically autonomous direction we've gone. And so, how do we relate to this community? I think, for starters, we need to recognize that it is just that, a community. A lot of people I've known who are in various ways associated with this community feel incredibly lonely, have felt incredibly ostracized throughout their lives. And one of the key factors that drew them to this community was just a sense of being embraced and welcomed in. So I think it's worth noting that, first of all, that there are motivations that go deeper than just political affiliations or just sexual preferences. It's actually deeper than that. So I think that's one way to begin. But then also, I think we need to be willing. We don't want to be too provocative. We don't want to be obnoxious with people, but we also need to be willing to tell the truth and be honest. I will say this, and I've said this with you before, Nathan. Nathan and I do a podcast, so please forgive us if we just lapse into podcast mode. I'm your co-host, Cameron McGill.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
So there you go. But I think I've said this to you before, Nathan. Love does not preclude confrontation, nor does it preclude self-sacrifice. So therein lies the balance. So confrontation means if you care deeply about somebody and you really love them and they're involved with something that you believe is harmful to their development as a person, what's the more loving thing to do? Say, well, it appears to be making them happy right now, and so I'm just going to let them keep doing this, whatever this habit is. Or to actually risk possibly compromising the friendship, losing them, making them very angry and upset, and actually confronting them on it. Most of us would recognize that the second option is the much more loving option. So we need to be willing to tell people honestly, in a spirit of intellectual honesty. If, as a Christian, I will say, yes, I stand by a traditional sexual ethic. I believe human beings, men and women, God created them male and female, and they're made in the image of God. And I believe sexuality is limited to the mode of expression that its author has designated. And I believe the author of human life and the author of human sexuality and the author of marriage is Christ. And he sets those limitations on me. And I live by those rules. I know that has implications for some people. But all of us are also called to self-sacrifice. Our colleague Sam Albury, who I think both of us would recommend to you as a resource here. Sam Albury speaks on these issues quite a bit, because Sam Albury would say that he is same-sex attracted, has been for a long, long time, and yet he leads a celibate lifestyle. And people often ask him, and they say, well, how do you do? I mean, that just must be so incredibly difficult. And he has an extremely convicting response to that. He says, yes, but Christianity demands self-sacrifice of all of us. If Christianity is costing you nothing, you have reason to examine your heart. So I think responding in love, we need to be willing to have those confrontations, loving confrontations, where we actually are honest about what we think. This is speaking to the Christians in the room, talking to those in this arena, but also we need to be willing to be self-sacrificial as well. We need to look at our own lives and say, am I truly leading a life of self-sacrifice? Am I dying to self? Have I laid everything at the feet of Christ? And I think we have cause always to examine our own hearts as well. Nathan, I'd like to weigh in a little bit there too, because I mean, especially with regard to the transgender issue, which gets into more complications as well.
Yeah, so I think in respecting the tone in which both of the questions were asked about how do we respond, one of those I think it's easy to say, well, I see things black and white, clear like this. And one of those that is challenging is that one of the difficulties I think when speaking to some of these ways of identifying ourselves is that person is bearing a heavy burden because they're expecting all of reality to adapt to a standard that exists in their mind. And so there isn't an objective reality that we can both point to have a framework for who they are. Mm-hmm. And that means that everything about you have to self-define. That's an incredible burden to have to bear. It's a real intellectual difficulty to have that conversation, but I think we need to be honest of saying, I really see this is important to you, but here's the difficulty that I'm having of adapting my version of reality to the version of reality that's in your mind. It's actually a question of epistemology. And so I think we can be sensitive about that and have it that way. But what I wanted to say about the question of how do we respond and maybe some of the historic tension in the church and why it's difficult for Christians to have this conversation well. And this comes from some ideas on identity applied to a different topic that Michael Ramsden and other leaders have done on this, is that if you think about how we construct an identity, most of our identities are based off of our thinking, off of our feeling, and off of our doing. So what do we think about? How do we feel? What do we do? We have that at the top. Our identity is constructed, actually it's like this stool, all right? So our identity is on top here, our thinking, our feeling, and our doing are here. This is who we are, and usually since we can't see what other people are thinking or feeling, what they do becomes the foundation of who they are. So you ask somebody, you want to introduce yourself to them, what do you do, right? That's kind of a standard, where do you go to school, what do you do, where do you live, kind of. Your identity is based off of what you do. The problem is, if you have an identity that is based off of an action, and then this action is no longer available to you, what happens to the stool? It collapses, right? It tips over. This is why, the quarterback who's the professional quarterback at 35 years old has no idea what to do with their life after they can't be a quarterback anymore, right? Because their whole identity was wrapped up in that. Or some people who retire and go to pieces because their identity was in that thing. So here's kind of the modern model for how identity is constructed. We built this, we hold our own identity. The problem is if it's based off of a feeling and then I no longer have that emotional experience, my identity collapses. If it's based off of an experience and I no longer have that emotion, my identity collapses. And of course, we've already talked about the action. Christianity says that though while the world looks at this model and operates this way, that the stool is actually upside down from the Christian perspective, that your identity is something that's given to you, foundational. It's a gift to you from God, and then your thinking, your feeling, and your doing flow out of that. And so if my identity is rooted at the bottom of who I am, and then you come to me and say, I think you're stupid. I think Christian apologists are stupid. I think, well, that's an interesting thing we should talk about. But it doesn't rock the core of my being because my identity is underneath that. However, if your identity is based off of an activity, and then that activity comes under scrutiny, you do not experience it as a critique of an activity, you experience it as a threat to your identity.
This is why Nathan demands we have stools.
Yeah. And so, you want me to say that again? If your identity is based off of an activity, and then that activity comes under scrutiny, you don't experience it as a threat or a critique of that activity, you experience it as a threat to your identity. So if you, living as a Christian, have a concept of your identity on the bottom, you're stable. You can say stuff to people and have conversations, and they can take it as how you think, feel, or do about it, whatever, we'll talk about it. However, in certain communities, and the ones that we're presently talking about, a lot of that identity is based off of an activity, and that's why the historic phrase of, hate the sin, love the sinner doesn't work, because if the identity of the action is based off of that activity, then it feels to the person who's receiving that critique as if it's an existential threat to who they are. Yep. Yeah. That does not answer the question for you, but I think you need to be aware of that perspective and the shift in the tension when you're having that conversation, and maybe that gives a little bit of an insight into how to respond in some of those situations. We only have like 87 questions here, so that's great. Here are a couple. Let me just kind of weave all of these together for you, Cameron, and can let you go from there. So, one is if people treated everyone as a neighbor, would the world be perfect? Where is our nation really going? Why do so many young people leave the church when they go to college? As we head toward a post-Christian America, how can we turn it around? How can we bring about a third great awakening? What would the world look like? And so these are kind of taking your destination question and applying it nationally and then to the church.
Yeah.
30 seconds, go.
All right, let's solve this. If everybody treated everybody else as a neighbor, the world would improve substantially, massively.
Mr. Rogers wouldn't even be needed.
Mr. Rogers wouldn't even be needed, because everybody already would be your neighbor. But I think you would see a dramatic shift. And let me put it this way. If even a small community started behaving like everybody else was their neighbor, you see this kind of outsized healing effect sometimes from certain groups of Christians in often hostile environments. The early church was a great example in Rome. But if even small groups, let's say if one nation had people behaving more like neighbors, you would see even from that an absolutely dramatic change in human beings. The reason I say that, the point I'm stressing there is that is the way it's supposed to be. And we all recognize that. We have every one of us has a conscience. And one of the teachers who often works with us at RZIM is Professor John Lennox, and he's brilliant. And he has this beautiful, marvelous way of saying this. Do you know that your conscience is an outpost of God's government? So you're getting powerful, moral, spiritual insight from your sense of right and wrong. We all have this sense if we're operating optimally. But the point is, what I was stressing in the talk is of our own resources, we can't do this. Because all of us are sinners. There's an archaic word that's very irrelevant. We like to, and often we've lost the sense of moral gravity associated with the word sin. One writer I like says it like this. He goes, when I hear the word sinful now, I'm much more liable to think of some decadent dessert, like chocolate, than I am to think about something that runs the risk of separating me from my eternal Lord. And yet the gravity of sin is tremendous. It's why the world is in the state that it is. It's why we are alienated. It's why we're in such turmoil and confusion. So we cannot treat others as our neighbors unless we're turning to God first. That was the point I was stressing. So what needs to happen is we need to recognize that need. And on a national scale, I'm not sure if I can speak in national terms of that many people coming to this kind of moral recognition all at once, but an awakening, this kind of language of revival that's often used, it's preceded, if you look at the historical examples, it's preceded by persistent, stubborn, careful, prolonged prayer from many of the Lord's faithful gathered together. And what comes with it also is a recognition of our own wretchedness, our own inability to save ourselves, and then a turning from our old ways to Christ to save us from ourselves. So I think we're so confused as a nation, and the first question got at this as well, because it goes back to that becoming aspect. We want to become whatever we want. We want to make of ourselves whatever we want to make, and yet we can't figure out what that is. See, this is why, if you talk about think about the word transitioning. It's such a loaded word right now. But transitioning points to that very indecisiveness that we're talking about, that existential angst that comes from the burden of thinking that your identity is what you have to manage, you have to create it. Just think about that. But if you are at root a person made in the image of God, that can liberate you to withstand some of the difficulties in this world. But again, where are we all going? We can't agree on it. So in many ways, a lot of us turn to the culture right now, and I think this is where, in some ways, the mental health crisis comes in. But the culture will tell you, just on the ground every day, how do you want to make your identity stick? How do you want to solidify who you are? Well, one powerful answer has been through achievement. That's one way to do it. Just go out there and achieve. Be successful. Realize your dreams.
Grow a big beard.
Grow a big beard. Who among the two of us is the successful one here? I'm colder too, but through achievement. But you see what's happening now? My wife had a really powerful insight here. I get a lot of my great insights from my wife. Anything else that's bad is probably from me. But she pointed out to me, she's a teacher, she said, none of my kids, the problem is they don't know how to fail. And why can't we fail? It's one thing if you fail to feel disappointment and sadness. That's totally normal and appropriate. But to be brought to a point of existential despair to where you want to take your own life because you didn't get into the school you wanted to get into, because you didn't get into the athletic program you wanted to get into, because you didn't get into the play, what's happening? We're putting so much more weight on achievement than we ever have in the past because we're looking at this as a means of delivering ourselves. And it's killing us. And so, once again, a lot of what I'm stressing sounds really bleak on the one hand, but I hope it's robustly and realistically hopeful on the other hand, because we're talking about the significance of Christianity here. And the significance of Christianity is, if it's true, you were made by the living God. And so nothing that less than a relationship with him will allow you to realize who you truly are. There's a deep, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. This is what Christ says. That sounds like a paradox, but it's so true in practice. If you try to figure out who you are and where you're going only on your own terms, you will run amok every time, and you'll let yourself down, and others will let you down. But if you pursue Christ and set aside, at great cost to yourself, if you just pursue him with all that you are, you'll find yourself discovering who you are in the process. And this is a wonderful countercultural message that I think is deeply true in practice when we actually see it. And it makes sense because that's actually the way we are made. That's how we are crafted. So much of when you remove Christianity, so much of our lives just doesn't make sense. And all of our current confusion, I think, points to it. So as a nation, we need to move beyond this understanding of autonomous freedom, of the idea that we can just be whatever we want to be and make of ourselves whatever we want to be. I don't see that reversing right now, Nathan, and I don't see any indication that that is slowing down. But what I think is happening is that for the first time in the United States, we're headed to a point where it's going to be less comfortable, less safe to be a Christian. And that's okay. Christians worldwide are probably just saying, join the club. This is always, in America, Christians have enjoyed a lot more comfort and stability than people in other nations have. But that may be coming to an end, and that's okay, because you know what? When Christianity stops being safe and comfortable, you start to figure out where your real convictions and loyalties lie. And so this ramped up hostility may be a key ingredient in a turnaround. But there's no historic moment that the Lord can't reverse. There's nothing that the Lord can't. But we need to also remember, and I want Nathan to weigh in here a little bit, and this is a line from my dad. My dad is Scottish. I don't have his cool accent. I'm sorry. I could speak with him for the rest of the time with a Scottish accent, and you'd probably take me much more seriously. But Dad always says the Christian hope is eschatological. That is, it is tied to Christ's return. We are the ones who are awaiting the King. So if we're looking for heaven in the here and now, we've misplaced our hope. Because Christians are the ones who are awaiting the King. Because Christ is coming back to judge the quick and the dead, to wipe away every tear, and to make all things new. If that's your hope, I think that's the other stabilizing factor. If your fundamental identity, you recognize that you're at the base there, you're made in the image of God, and you are awaiting your King. You see, that gives you the freedom to endure the hardships. You've always got a light at the end of the tunnel. And it gives you the freedom to, even when there's political, upheaval and things are falling apart, you care and you're invested, but it's not a point of despair because you recognize that ultimately Christ is on his throne and he is returning no matter what happens. I sincerely believe this. And it animates everything about my existence. And I can tell you it is one of the most freeing aspects of my life here and now. I love that Nathan was stressing the here and now. What do we do now? Do we just hurtle through life like it's a series of obstacle courses until we can get through the pearly gates? I don't think that's right at all. Jesus says in John chapter 17, I came that they may have life in abundance. And that begins now. That begins as soon as you start following Jesus. That eternal quality and inextinguishable joy enters into your life and pervades your existence and sends out healing ripples of joy wherever you go. This is just the natural outcome of being a Christian. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
pick another delicious flavor while I talk about that. I forget, so what percentage are we at of people in the U.S. who say they had some sort of born-again experience? 60%, something like that? Somewhere in that neighborhood.
Right.
Does that sound about right? I was just, two things. One, I like the turn that you took there. It's easy for me to ask the big level national question. Jesus always then loops it back around to the individual and says, well, what about you? And so that's where the gospel confronts me is, well, what then about me? Am I loving my neighbor well? And it's easy for me to say, well, the people over there and the other side of Milwaukee, but on my street, we're good. And Jesus doesn't let us get away with that. He sticks the finger right in our own eye to do that. I think it's I can't remember who the quote is from, but in the beginning of Dallas Willard's book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, he talks about, so let's say America is 60% Christian of some flavor, and he talks about Jesus saying, you are the salt of the earth. And he says, if you had a pound of meat and it was 60% salt, do you think you would notice? Yes, you would. In case it's not a trick question. Yeah, it's not a trick question. You would notice. And so I think there's room here for, as we think about the national trajectory, to also do some healthy introspection as the church too, to say what collectively is our role within this, and then individually also. Again, Jesus is not just telling us about how to love our neighbor, but also redefining who our neighbor is a big part of that. And so those will be two closer to home things that I can work on, even if I can't initiate the third grade awakening. So I still have some homework to do. I want to take a stab at this one, and then you can jump in there. So this one says, I have a hard time accepting that I'm not self-made. Though I understand and know I've had help along the way, it was also my choice to accept that said help. Telling me that who I am is pre-written to me takes away free will that we were given, or rather it's an illusion. Why would I accept a fate that I had no say in? And then very politely says, please forgive my potentially negative tone. I don't think it's a negative tone. I think it's a good,
no forgiveness necessary. It's a great question.
That's a great question. Do you want me to run at that for a second and then you respond since I read it, or? Okay.
Go for it.
I'll say things while you think. So here's an important part of that definition of saying that we're made in the image of God, is that it bears a little bit of thinking of what does that actually mean. And I think that we have 4 minutes to answer this. Great. That part of it is that being made in the image of God means that we have the capacity to be in relationship with God, that we have real responsibility, and that we are made to reflect God in a meaningful way. That there's a sense in which we are the stamp of God's image on his artwork, that when people look at us, ideally, they're supposed to recognize the goodness of God. That's what Jesus did in his ministry. And so there's a call to participation. This isn't a pre-written, coded, stamped out, line by line. You have the responsibility to respond to the revelation of God. That doesn't mean that you aren't given an inherent value, but what it is that you do with the gifts that you've been given do radically dictate the direction of your life. Sin in and of itself in the human life is not necessarily a unique power. It's taking the good things that God has given us and weaponizing them and using them out of the context for which they were created. So when Eve looks at the fruit and sees that it's good and pleasing the eye, reaches out her hand and takes, and all of that is good. It's just that the context in which she was actualizing those God-given gifts was the wrong context. And so the gifts that God has given you, being made as an image, means that you do have real responsibility, that you're called to real participation. That also means not just that you're responsible, that you can affect actual change in the world, but it also means that then you bear a level of responsibility for the decisions that you do and you don't make. And so within Christianity, I see a foundational identity that's given to me as a statement of value, but not as a pre-scripted, this is the way that it will always be. I think God's purpose is fulfilled in our lives, though his will isn't always done. And before you crucify me, let me clarify that. If you look at somebody, for example, like the life of the character in the Bible of Samson, what was Samson's purpose in life? God was going to use Samson to save Israel. Did God use Samson to save Israel? Yes. How did that work out for Samson? Well, it was a dumpster fire, because Samson did everything wrong at every single point along the way. And so he went against the will of God for his life, but God's purpose was still fulfilled within it. And so somewhere in that you find a nice balance, I think, of recognizing that the value that we have is not based off of what we do, but the choices that we have really do matter. And Scripture speaks to us as if both of those things are true, that God does know that we do have real freedom, that there are real consequences to our action, and he holds us really accountable for that. So it's not something to throw out there as a sense of fear of, I better do the right thing or else. a little bit of that, but more it's a call to participation in the goodness that God has created, to say that you were meant to function in a certain way, and you will find the deepest level of satisfaction when you're doing this in step with my Spirit. It's an invitation, not a dictation, meaning that you will have help along the way. And part of it, maybe you can comment some of the language that you use. You said you discover who you are. I think maybe another way to phrase that is that so much of what God has done in the lives of his people throughout time is he's asked them to remember. So the Passover in the Old Testament was you need to stop once a year and recognize what has happened to you, because part of your identity is based off of who you are and what I have done for you. So you reflect on who I am and the goodness of my character. And so in that sense, our identity is something that's remembered. We look back to find the stability of the goodness of who God is. It's why we celebrate communion in the way we remember what has been done for us. And so that stabilizes the value that we have and the identity that we have, but also then again provides the foundation for our thinking and our feeling and our doing to flourish out of that in a way that's in conformity with the will of God for our lives. And so there's I don't know if you want to clarify what I've said there, but there's a both and there that I don't think are mutually exclusive.
That's good. I think I'll just make a few quick comments because I think we have to end here. But yeah, and also on a grassroots level, what I mean by that is, in America, the myth that you make yourself persists quite strongly, that we shape who we are. We didn't bring ourselves into the world. Yes, you do acknowledge that, but we didn't teach ourselves to speak. We were shaped fundamentally by the households we're born into, for better or for worse. Some of us are born into better circumstances, and others of us are born into worse circumstances. And they don't completely define us. We exercise responsibility. But I can tell you about a family member I know who was adopted out of the foster system, for instance. All of the socioeconomic cards are stacked against him. And he was born in circumstances profoundly different from mine. He didn't have virtually none of the early opportunities that I had. He didn't have the love poured into him that I had, and he has had a very difficult life as a result of that. Now, do I think he's responsible for his decisions? Absolutely. Somebody I used to know would say that our past may explain us, it doesn't excuse us. So we bear responsibility as well, but we're not self-made in the purest sense. We have all been born into various circumstances, and those circumstances shape us at a fundamental level. That's what I mean when I say we're born into relationships of basic belonging. We're dependent creatures. As Americans, it's very hard for us to admit that. Because this is a country, another one of the great myths of our nation is the rags to riches story. And there are people who have been born into impoverished circumstances, and there is an extraordinary amount of opportunity available in this nation, more so than most other nations. And so that's also allowed this myth to persist. But still, even those who have ridden a wave all the way to absolutely titanic heights would tell you, if they're honest, that they were dependent on other people who poured into them, took them under their wing, mentored them, poured into them. So we're shaped by those around us. We're inescapably relational creatures. I think Thomas Hobbes is totally wrong. That we're in our natural state, we're in a state of radical, total, independent freedom. That just doesn't make sense of human life. Doesn't make sense of the way we're born, doesn't make sense of the way we learn. So that's what I'm getting at a grassroots level. And the picture of Christianity with regard to your salvation is exactly as Nathan's been saying. The story of the gentle yoke that Christ says, you walking side by side with your Lord, working together with his empowerment, but you're working with him. And this is where I'll end on a note with Dallas Willard, because I like Dallas Willard too. He says, we often talk about the cost of discipleship, because that's the title of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's great book, but we rarely talk about the cost of non-discipleship, which means you do this all by yourself. You're all on your own, trying to manage everything, trying to manage your identity, trying to manage your significance, your life. The picture of Christianity is that you are laboring side by side with your Lord. By the way, that's an astonishingly humble picture that he uses of the yoke. This is the Lord of all creation saying this. So we bear we're responsible as well, but I don't want to be swept into the line of thinking that says basically we're just blank slates and we make of ourselves whatever we want, because I think that falls prey to the very confusions that have led us to the point that we're at today as a nation.
Well,
Much more can be said.
So we have a lot of great questions here, all kinds on skepticism, evil, the Trinity, creation ex nihilo,
all the easy ones.
transubstantiation, who wrote the Bible, pedagogical styles, quantum physics, all sorts of great stuff that we didn't get to. So Cameron and I will be around after this. Please come up and chat with us. We'll even turn off the microphone so not everybody hears your question. But we'd love to engage with you and talk to you. I think we're going to turn it over to Cindy now, who will give us the final instructions of where we go from here. Thank you guys for being a great show.
I've got 3 minutes to live. I've got a knife in my bag. Okay, I'm afraid of dying.
Yeah.
There's a knife in my bag.
Okay.
I'm scared of dying. I want to go to heaven.
Right.
What would you tell me?
How can you get to heaven?
Yeah, I'm dying. I've got 2.5 minutes to live. What would you say to
I
me?
hope you had a good life. You're being good, so you come to heaven anyway.
But I haven't been good. I've lied and stolen. I'm feeling really guilty. Yeah, I've had
See the church?
Yeah. You think they can help?
They
I got 2 minutes to live.
Yeah,
You're going to
sure.
drag me to the church. I'm lying on the ground. I'm bleeding to death.
No, I carry you there.
So what would the church say to me?
I don't know, that's his job, not my job.
Your job. So you just say,
I'm
it's
a
not,
bad guy too.
You'd say, it's not my job.
I tell you that if you can forgive yourself,
I forgive myself, but I'm scared of God. I'm scared I've broken His
God
commandments.
forgives everything.
Just-
If
so
He
Hitler's-
believes that you truly are sorry for any wrongdoings you've done in your life,
So I
He will
could be
forgive
sharing
you.
a mansion with Hitler?
Possibly, but possibly Hitler has redeemed himself as well.
So 6 million Jews, and Hitler says, sorry about that, and God lets him in? To heaven?
Well, I believe that everybody's soul goes to a place that might be heaven, and it then comes back, and every time you're on the earth, you learn from each life that you live on earth, and then you get reincarnated.
So I'm
and
down to 1 minute, and what have I got to do? Nothing at all.
Everybody's life is a lesson in something, so each life that you live, you learn something, and you grow from each life.
So you believe in reincarnation?
Yes, totally.
What were you in the last life?
I don't quite know. I think I lived in medieval times, actually.
And who gives the new
Yeah.
bodies to people? Who's in charge
The
of it?
souls choose what.
You can choose
a
what
body,
you want?
A body is just skin. It's just
So where do you get the information from? Do you make it up?
Not sure about that one.
It's no matter what kind of ritual you do. It's no matter to whom you pray and how you pray. As long as I believe, like yourself, okay, that there is God. There's something above us, something great, something we can't understand fully. It is.
How can
okay?
I get to heaven? I'm not Jewish, I'm a Gentile. I've sinned, I've lied and stolen. How can you
I
help me?
am not part of the Jewish religion as is. Okay?
So what, I just believe
I
in
just
God.
believe that you must be a good person. You must be
I'm not a good person.
No, I mean,
Do you think you'll go to heaven when you die?
Yeah.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because I'm a good person.
Now, let me ask you some questions, see if you're good. Have you ever told a lie?
Yeah, of course.
What do you call someone who tells lies?
Liar?
Have you ever stolen something, even if it's small, in your whole life?
Maybe. Yeah.
What do you call someone who steals things?
A thief.
Have you ever used God's name in vain?
No.
Never once?
Probably once.
Well, that's called blasphemy. It's using God's name as a cuss word. It's very serious. 1 to go. Jesus said, if whoever looks at a woman and lusts after her, you desire her sexually, you commit adultery with her in your heart. Have you ever looked at a woman with lust? You don't need to say any more. So listen to this. By your own admission, you're a lying, thieving, blasphemous, adulterer at heart, and you have to face God on Judgment Day. If He judges you by the 10 Commandments on the Day of Judgment, do you think you'd be innocent or guilty? What you thinking about? Lying, thieving, blasphemous, adulterer at heart?
Yeah, everybody does.
That's true. Would you go
Even
to
you, right?
Yes, sir. Would you go to heaven or hell?
Well, I'd rather choose to go to heaven.
You choose to go to heaven, but the Bible says all liars will have their part in the lake
But
of
He
fire.
will forgive me because
Why?
I've done many good things in my life.
Okay, now here's a little thought for you. Try that in a court of law. Say, Judge, I raped that woman. I've done a lot of good things in my
Won't
life.
work.
It won't work, will it? And it's not going to work with God. He can't be bribed by your good works.
He knows what I did.
Yeah. If God judges you by the 10 Commandments, you'd be guilty on Judgment Day. Is that right? Like me, you'd be guilty.
Yeah, I suppose so, but I think God knows that deep down there is good within everybody, and He, you know, when your soul goes to heaven, you get a chance to come back and.
Susan, let me give you
redeem
one
yourself.
quote from Jesus. Do you know what justifying yourself is? Do you know what that means? This is what Jesus said of the religious leaders of His time. He said, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly thought of in the sight of man is an abomination in the sight of God. All our good deeds mean nothing to God. It's like a rapist saying to a judge, "Judge, I raped that woman, I slit her throat, but I want to tell you, I give money to the Red Cross."
Nobody really knows, do they? Nobody's ever actually been there and
Yes,
physically.
they have. We've got the
heaven
greatest
and-
testimony, the testimony of Jesus Christ. He came down from heaven to do the will of God. Can't earn everlasting life by doing something. You can only come by God's gift.
But as long as I live good,
You haven't lived good. You're a liar and a thief.
Yeah, I'm not proud of it.
Okay. The only thing you can do is call upon the mercy of God. And he can give you mercy because Jesus died in your place. He took your punishment on the cross. Did you know that? When he was on the cross, he was being punished for your sins, for my sins, for the sin of the world. Then he rose from the dead. What you've got to do is repent. Don't just confess your sins to a priest. Go to God and say, "God, I'm sorry for my sins." Say, "Create in me a clean heart." And then turn from your sin and put your trust in Jesus Christ. The minute you do that, God will forgive you and grant you everlasting life. It can happen in an instant, not even 3 minutes, because God's ready to accept you if you're ready to repent and ask his forgiveness and trust the Savior.